Just recently, I had the opportunity to have a nice discussion with someone who is very knowledgeable in the areas of classical languages and literature, the traditional languages of Europe and the Middle East, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And from my perspective, I think he has a lot of expertise in this area. He's really good at what he does. And he teaches. He's a professor. He teaches these classical languages. And I had the opportunity to have a nice discussion with him. We were going through some various Latin phrases and really the implications moving into modern languages, etc. And we were breaking down uses of the word et in Latin. And so if you've clicked on this video, you may already have some knowledge of Latin or of some Romance languages or languages in general, or of Shakespeare, etc. And so please keep in mind that the word et usually is translated over into English as and. And you see the word et. Now, in terms of it evolving through time, the Latin et pretty much evolved directly into the Romance languages without a lot of modification. Basically, et turned into e, or e, etc. Moving into the Romance languages, your French, your Spanish, your Italian, etc., as well as other languages. And so we have the et there, that et tu Brute, that the et could be used as and. It can also be used as also. Also you, Brutus, Julius Caesar, saying to Brutus during his assassination, when all the senators were assassinating him back on the Ides of March in 44 BC. And so we broke that down in a little detail about the et tu Brute. And so we've already gone through the et, that the et pretty much moved into the Romance languages without a lot of modification. And the two is, in Latin, it is the informal case of you. Okay, so it is the informal. It is the form you'd use talking to your family, talking intimately with other people. It would be tu. And so tu, more or less in Latin, is cognate to the Germanic du, as well as in English, in the early modern English, the word thou. And what's really interesting about the word thou, and as we know, speakers of English, that thou has largely disappeared over the centuries. However, it's really interesting to see that when you see the word thou these days, oftentimes people use that word with a bit of reverence when they see the word thou, because in fact, because we see it in, for instance, biblical references, or we see it in, for instance, plays, by Shakespeare, etc. But what's interesting is that the word thou is, in fact, the familiar tense of you, which disappeared, which is similar to du in the Germanic languages and tu in the Italic languages. And so we wouldn't think that, because a lot of people believe that, hey, there's all of this reverence put on the word thou. Now, however, keep in mind that the proper usage of the word thou, when it was used commonly, was as a tense between family, when you're being very intimate with people, between family and good friends, people close to you. So a very interesting, very interesting piece of information, I believe there. But anyway, we're going back to that statement now of et tu Brute. So the two pretty much moved into Romance without a lot of modification. And you see tu, toi, like the French toi as an example. It's very, very similar, that it moved straight in. And the Brute is very interesting, because that tense of Brutus, the Brute, is more like it is the vocative or the vocative tense of Brutus. And so vocare, it means like calling, like you're calling to someone. It is how you'd address someone directly. You'd say Brute, or if you talk to someone, it would be in the vocative or vocative tense. And it's interesting because largely that it isn't seen very often in a lot of the modern languages in the Italic branch of your Indo-European languages. However, if you look at other branches, as an example of the Indo-European language branch, like the Slavic languages, as an example, you see that vocative or that vocative tense, in some of the Slavic languages, which I think is pretty interesting. Because it hasn't completely gone away. And in the Indo-European languages, you still see it in other languages. But in any case, we have the et tu Brute, and someone brought up the fact that Shakespeare may have written that in his play, as some of the final words of Julius Caesar when he was getting assassinated. But what was interesting is that it was brought up in the discussion, and this is something that I had heard of, but I hadn't heard about it in much detail, is that in fact, some historians, and one good thing about the classical world and the Roman Empire and the Roman world is that, they were very good on dates, and they were very good on chronicling. They have nice records. And it's really good to see that we have different historians that lived at that time that were able to keep track of things. And we have accounts of many different activities and many different significant events, through history at that time. And some of the historians that were there, that were there writing, at that time, that were able to write down an account of what happened during Julius Caesar's assassination. One of them, that there are some historians that believe that Julius Caesar didn't say his final words in Latin, that in fact they believe that he didn't say et tu Brute, but that in fact he used the Greek. He talked to Brutus in Greek and said Caesu teknon, or Caesu teknon. And it's interesting to see that, because the kai or ke that means and so keep in mind that Greek is a little different. It's its own language branch that is a little different from the Italic languages. But you see su is the informal you, similar to the two of the Latin that we've talked about before. And so we have Caesu teknon. And what's interesting to see is that the word teknon, he doesn't address him as Brutus. In fact, the account is that he says, and you, child, my child. And what's interesting is that in modern Greek, as I understand, that teknon, in modern Greek, it's techno. Techno is a word in Greek, and I believe it's still used. It may not be used that often, but I believe that techno is used in modern Greek. Because keep in mind that Greek at that time, at the time of Julius Caesar, the Roman Empire, etc., that Greek was the language of, let's say, the language of high society. It was the language of culture, of literature, more the language of the elite, like the cultured language. And it's interesting that the Romans conquered Greece, but Greece conquered the hearts of the Romans. And following that conquest of Greece, Greek was very, that it was common among people as a language of culture and literature, as I said. And so it makes sense that senators, as an example, would be speaking in Greek. It would make sense. What would I think? Or what would a historian think Julius Caesar would have actually said, right? And so I'm led to believe that I understand that people spoke Greek, that, as I said, it's language of culture, literature, etc., and that he could have spoke Greek at that time. But keep in mind, he was in process of getting assassinated. And oftentimes, when you're in a high stress environment like that, to say the least, that I figured that probably you're not thinking like, hey, I want to speak the language of culture and literature right now. I would imagine that you'd probably want to speak maybe in your native language, or in something that would be a little simpler, right? I would think. So it may be in Latin or the native language, that they used at the time. You know, it's interesting to see, though, that different historians have different accounts. And so some historians believe, as an example, that that he didn't say anything. You know, he didn't have any of those famous last words, and that the last words were more or less poetic. Now, I can see that if you're getting assassinated in process, you know, you may have other things to worry about, other than saying something poetic right before you pass away. And so I think it makes sense. I think it's very interesting about the different historians and their perspective on the account of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March. And so, in any case, it's very interesting in my view, you know, that when you read Shakespeare, you know, whenever you have maybe read Shakespeare in the past, that you see that quote there of et tu brute, you know, in Shakespeare. And when I first saw that, I was led to believe that, oh yeah, that was a quote directly from Julius Caesar, you know. But in some cases, you know, from some perspectives, that there may be a difference between what is written and what actually happened. So I hope that that was interesting for you. It definitely was for me. Please feel free to comment below as needed. Thanks a lot.